Hello, my name is Joanna SoÄ. I work at the University of Silesia in Poland, and I am happy to share with you some thoughts on E Dickinson's poem number 491, according to Thomas Johnson's numeration. I will read the poem. While it is alive until death touches it, while it and I lap one air, dwell in one blood, under one sacrament, show me division can split or pair. Love is like life, merely longer. Love is like death during the grave. Love is like the fellow of the resurrection, scooping up the dust and chanting, "Live." The main focus of the poem is on love. It is love that hides behind the pronoun it in the first stanza and becomes explicitly referred to in the second. Love, usually defined as a kind of emotion or deep attachment, here in this poem is an autonomous power. It is very mighty. It makes a union with the speaker, but it surpasses human life. It's as powerful as death, and even more so, as it most probably is able to restore human life in its bodily shape after death. E Dickinson would often refer to love in her poems, and in many of them, love is presented as a powerful capacity, an all-encompassing universality which infiltrates all that exists. In a much later famous epigram, for example, Dickinson writes, I quote, "That love is all there is all we know of love. It is enough. The phrase should be proportioned to the groove," unquote. Such love resembles the divine power acknowledged by the mystics. It brings to mind a divinity who, for Meister Eckhart, for instance, is, I quote, "all love and only love," unquote. In this context, love appears to be the ultimate reality affirmed by those who experienced a mystical insight into the mystery of being. What strikes me then in the first stanza of the poem is the way in which E Dickinson inscribes love within the temporal dimension of human existence. It is indicated by the very first word, while, suggesting a limited duration, and we soon learn what is the limit of love's life. It is death. Surprisingly, we learn that love, which we are inclined to perceive as something similar to divine reality, is alive only until it is touched by death. Of course, the vision of embodied, albeit divine love touched by death is not absent from Christian tradition. On the contrary, at the heart of the Christian notion of the resurrection, there is the crucified body of Christ, and it certainly is an important context here. But the poem itself lacks this theological perspective. It doesn't refer to it strictly, and I would not like to impose it. The first stanza indicates that the initial liveliness of love is somewhat conditioned by the living body of the speaker. They breathe the same air, they dwell in the same blood, which suggests that human bodily existence is the most proper place for both the poem's I and love. E Dickinson uses a very strong word here as she refers to the sacrament, and if we assume after St. Augustine that the sacrament is an outward sign of the inward grace, we become aware that in this poem the presumed divine presence manifests itself within a living body of a human being. And what the poem underlines here very strongly is that those, let's say, three elements, I, my bodily existence, and love, are in a somewhat Trinitarian way, based on a profound net of interactive relations, inseparable. But here comes the until the whole union is touched by death. And if we took into account the corporeal intimacy, we are no longer surprised that when the body ceases to live, the love is being in some way affected as well. I would like to linger over the notion of death for a while, as it often recurs in Emily Dickinson's poems, and the way it is presented by the poet, again, to some extent, resembles the acknowledgements of the mystics. Many of her poems describe a mysterious near-death experience, a state in which the speaker appears to be dead but eventually comes back to life, and this return is most usually accompanied by the feeling of disappointment. I heard a fly buzz when I died from the poem 591 is probably the most famous example. In the poem 160, Just Lost When I Was Saved, the speaker acknowledges that she was on the onset with eternity and that she feels, I quote, odd secrets of the line to tell, unquote. And although these secrets do not seem very pleasant, the speaker compares herself to a pale reporter who saw something behind the awful door before it was sealed. She seems to be determined to go back and prolong this state as long as possible. It is very interesting for me how it corresponds with what Saint Teresa of Avila wrote when she was comparing on several occasions the mystical state of the meditative prayer to death. For example, I quote, "This state is a sleep of all faculties. It is like a person who is soon to die a death that he longs for, and in that agony he is rejoicing with ineffable joy. This seems to me to be nothing less than an all but complete death to everything in the world," unquote. There is then a possibility that in Emily Dickinson's poetry the notion of death is ambiguous and may refer also to a profound mystical experience in which a human being somewhat ceases to exist for the sake of the holistic union with something much greater than him or herself. The longing for death that Emily Dickinson displays in many poems to some extent may be also culturally induced, rooted in religious tradition of the Puritans, who considered the moment of death to be, I quote, the meeting point with God. They were being constantly reminded by the preachers that they will face God the moment they would die, and this may happen any time. There is nothing shocking then about a poet from an American Puritan family of the 19th century who desires to die. What should be shocking, however, is that it is precisely in this matter that Emily Dickinson seems to challenge and question her religious tradition. In a poem number 156, the speaker enthusiastically exclaims, I quote, "Dying, dying in the night. Won't somebody bring the light so I could see which way to go into the everlasting snow?" We should be a bit disturbed by now, as the everlasting snow doesn't sound well. But it is even worse as the poem develops, because in the second stanza, the person asks with disappointment, I quote, "And Jesus, where is Jesus gone? They said that Jesus always came," unquote. Maybe that is why the person who goes back to life in the poem 160 is compared to the pale reporter who saw a terrible mystery. A similar situation, but in a different way, is presented in one of Emily Dickinson's most famous poems. I refer to the poem 1551, in which she writes, I quote, "Those dying then knew where they went. They went to God's right hand. That hand is amputated now, and God cannot be found," unquote. Again, Dickinson refers to the moment of dying in order to underline that, contrary to what her ancestors believed in, God is not to be found in death. A dying person is not in the hands of God. He or she is rather adrift with no solid ground. And even if the state resembles a bit the dark night of the soul described by St. John of the Cross, it definitely is not the happy night he wrote about. It is accompanied by the feelings of solitude and doubt it is. But here comes the well-known second stanza of the poem, which says, I quote, "The abdication of belief makes the behavior small, better an ignis fatuus than no illum at all," unquote. Well, an ignis fatuus does not recall love's living flame that, according to St. John of the Cross, burns in the heart of the mystic. It definitely does not guide toward the source of life. On the contrary, it is a deceptive phosphorescent light that hovers over a swampy ground. And still, we are advised, especially when dying, to follow it, even though as soon as we recognize the nature of the light, we must become aware that what awaits us there, where the light leads us, is death. With this in mind, I'd like to return to the poem I chose to read, because in the second stanza, and this I think is the most difficult moment of the poem, Emily Dickinson writes that love, with all the profound meaning we bestowed upon it, is, I quote, like death during the grave, unquote. What does it mean? What is death doing during the grave? It seems to me it is dissolving. And again, there is this aspect of duration, and the temporal dimension is being stressed, as if beyond this earthly life there was no eternity either, no metaphysical horizon to arrive at, only the patient work of love, which becomes death. But maybe the important destination to be reached here is the death itself. And here the mystical context becomes especially important for me. Meister Eckhart writes, for example, I quote, "Make a start with yourself by abandoning yourself," unquote. And similarly to St. John of the Cross, he refers to the metaphor of the journey, which corresponds also with Emily Dickinson's Ignis Fatuus. I quote, "So if you wish to find your way, lose yourself," unquote. This was Meister Eckhart as well. And this, I think, is what death is all about. It's about losing everything. And we must lose ourselves for real. That is why the poems I've quoted, it seems to me, lack this metaphysical ground. They refer to a state in which we lose ourselves and we are without support, or as Emily Dickinson writes in the poem 355, I quote, "without a chance or spare or even the report of land to justify despair," unquote. Because the destination is not really something external. It is all about the inward transformation which is triggered the moment we die to ourselves and to the world. And the reason why I so stubbornly allude to the mystics is, and not because I think that death and the resurrection is in Emily Dickinson's poem a metaphor of the mystical conversion. I just wouldn't like to think of that in terms of qualitative difference. Maybe the difference lies only in the degree. Maybe what we experience in death is just a more radical version of what the mystics experience in their union with the divine. Let's take a final look at Emily Dickinson's poem on love, death, and the resurrection. Love and I, we, lead a common bodily existence. We are one, but our body dies, and love helps me to lose myself completely, because then it, namely love, can be touched by death. And it is touched like we touch an instrument to make a sound. So when love is finally touched by death, it begins to chant, and what it chants is the imperative to live. And it is only then that we recognize the voice of the Creator, and we know that it can recreate our bodily being. It can do it because it remembers us from the inside, remembers our breathing and the way blood used to circulate in our vessels, because it is this love that has been burning within my body all the time. Thank you very much for your attention.